What does a post-election America look like? Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie Lake, and today I'm talking markets with Jacob Shapiro, head of geopolitical and macro at Bespoke Group. Hi, Jacob. It's great to have you on again.
Hey, Maggie. It's great to be with you.
So, are you experiencing election fatigue like the rest of us?
Well, I am, except that I know that as soon as the election is called one way or the other, we're going to start talking about 2028. Like, there's no end to this. So you just sort of at some point have to turn it off and stop paying attention. But yes, I am certainly fatigued of this question, and I'm eager to put it behind us.
So, I'm curious, what are you getting the most questions about? What are clients most concerned about?
Well, in my experience, clients can't help themselves when we're this close to the end of the race, even though they know that I'm not a pollster and that I have no special expertise here. They want to know, like, from the people that they trust, well, what do you think is going to happen? So the most common question right now is who's going to win the election? And then the second question is, well, what should I do depending on what happens there? And part of my answer to clients is, I've been advising clients about this since literally February or March. Like, most of the decisions for clients that I already have been made. If you're trying to react instinctively to what's going to happen, you're probably going to be caught on the back foot. It's a way of signaling that you should get ready for the next cycle, not for this one.
Yeah. So how do you see this playing out over the next? Are there any surprises that you think are in store, or the unexpected? I mean, it's so hard to game this one, I think, because of all the anticipation and because of what the polls have been suggesting. How are you seeing the next week or so play out?
Well, it's funny. I think it's going to be relatively simple. And I've been going back to what my fellow Louisianian James Carville said in the first Clinton election, which is it's about the economy, stupid. And if it's about the economy, stupid, and Gallup says that people care about the economy more than in any previous election in the last 35, 40 years since 2008, so more than 50% of the electorate, that's the most important issue. If that's the most important issue, the national polling is telling us that by a margin of about 9 to 10%, the Americans think that Trump is going to be better at managing the economy. Now, we can put aside whether that's true or not. I don't particularly think that that's true, but it doesn't matter. That's what the electorate is telling us. And then the real question is, in the 7 or 8 swing states that are up for grabs, is that margin going to translate in those states going for President Trump? And then the flip side is there going to be enough fatigue on Trump himself that the base doesn't necessarily come out and Kamala is able to push on maybe the African-American community or on an energized liberal vote? Maybe she gets some young people to vote out in numbers that they haven't in previous elections. If she can sort of push down turnout and push up turnout for herself in a couple of those key swing states, maybe she can win it. But I think she's fighting the uphill battle. Like, the American electorate has been very clear. They care about the economy first and foremost, and that they think Trump is better for the economy. Those are two things that the polls are not ambiguous about at all.
We've seen people, I think certainly the market seems to believe that, right? And we've seen a run up in equities and some people really trying to focus on maybe energy. Some of these things absolutely were in place beforehand. There's some handicapping, but there's a lot of other influences going on. Is there any of these connections that you think are tenuous or that may not turn out the way that they're expected? There seems to be this sense that a Trump presidency will be bullish for a lot of things, but I wonder if you agree with that.
Well, I think the recent run-up has much more to do with what the Fed is doing. And I think the Fed has cut into strength. I think that was a mistake. And I've been talking about inflation being volatile and not going in one direction for literally months, and nobody's been listening. So I think that's where we're headed, and that's why we're seeing this run-up right now. There are some things that would be bullish if Trump was elected and some things that would be bullish if Harris were elected. It's sort of not a perfect story. But one thing I have been saying to clients over and over is, look, if you want to be as prepared as possible for the result of this election, be prepared for a populist, protectionist, America First ideologue. And if you prepare for that person, you'll be covered for basically 90% of what either side is going to do. When it comes to just foreign and trade policy, because I think they're very different on domestic policy, but if we're just talking about foreign and trade policy, the only major difference between these two candidates is that Trump, like George Washington, thinks that the United States should not have allies. And so he's not just going to go after China. China's going to bear the brunt of his ire, but he's talking about going after Europe and going after Mexico and going after U.S. allies. Harris is not going to do that. She has more of a multilateral bent. So she is going to try to continue the improvement in transatlantic ties that has continued under Biden. She's going to have a more cooperative relationship, especially with Mexico. So like those are some of the areas where I think there really will be some influence. But at the broadest possible level, like there's no free trade fiscal conservative in this race. They're both saying the exact same thing. It's just one wants income taxes, one wants tariffs. It's all basically the same thing.
Which is ironic because this election is being painted as the stark choice for the future between these two. And I understand a lot of that is probably around social issues, but I think if you probably polled people, they wouldn't say, oh, economically, these two are basically the same person, which is a version of what you're saying. In that, let's go back to the domestic. They're both going to push fiscally. This is a populist situation. So spending looks like spending is going up. The bond market has seemed worried about that, or at least we've seen bond yields rising on concern around inflation. I mean, the idea they care about deficits, it doesn't seem like anybody ever cares about deficits. So I'm not sure it's exactly that. But is this next president, if they pursue those policies, looking at a bond market that will be in revolt or looking at higher interest rates?
Well, this is one of the areas in which the tactics really matter here. So even if Trump and Harris are going to push on the same string over a 4-year time horizon, Trump has talked about tariffs and talked about them immediately, whereas Harris is talking about more selective uses and taxes and stimulus and things like that. If it's Trump, then we're staring at, if you believe him, and maybe it's all a negotiating tactic. My buddy Marco Papich, who if you haven't had on, I'm sure you'll have him on soon, thinks that, if it's Trump, it's going to be some huge Nixon maneuver and it was all threat to try and get some kind of, understanding between the United States and China. But if you take Trump at his word, we're talking about 60% tariffs against goods coming into the country from China and up to 10 to 20% from all other countries in the world. And that's going to mean a rapid increase in inflation. And then I think it probably gets followed by a deflationary spike, because I think it'll scare people so much that we'll actually go in the opposite direction. But it's going to have immediate consequences there that we're going to have to sift through. If it's Harris, we probably push in the same direction that we are right now, where the Fed is trying to figure out what's going on and thinking that monetary policy is the be-all, end-all, whereas Harris will be pushing an America First industrial policy that doesn't match with what the Fed is doing with interest rates. And so we'll keep sort of going, we think interest rates are going to go up, but inflation, the print was not what we expected. So now we have to think about doing the opposite. I mean, just think about 2 months ago, everybody was saying that the cuts weren't big enough. And now people are looking at the economy and saying maybe they shouldn't have been cutting at all. So I think we're in for sort of that kind of ping-ponging if it is going to be Harris. So I do think there's differences if you're thinking about what the first 3 to 6 months look like as a result of the general tactics that they're talking about. But the general posture, I think you're exactly right. Like, we're going to see more spending, we're going to see more protection for critical U.S. industries, but that's not going to change no matter who wins.
Yeah, I would. The rising yields, rising inflation, and rising yields is a major problem for whoever inherits that job, because I would think we certainly have strong economic growth. So there's an argument the economy can handle it. But how do you see that playing out? That's going to be a tough one for investors. Does it hurt the stock market? Do we have a more interventionist, especially if it's Trump, much more likely to change out personnel to suit his needs? I mean, does it put the Fed in the crosshairs?
The Fed has put itself in the crosshairs in some sense by the way that it's injected itself into these things. But again, I'm not one who thinks that, I don't think that the result of the election is going to mean things that much, because as you just said, the economy is growing and we're getting the rise of AI and robotics and of all of these different innovations that are increasing productivity. In some sense, the biggest problem that the United States has right now, from my perspective, is the labor market. Population growth, if you look at a chart of population growth in the United States, it's the lowest that it's been in 120 years. And meanwhile, we have an immigration crisis at the southern border that has been completely stalled because neither party wants to work with each other. They just want to yell at each other and call each other fascists. So you have all this labor that wants to come in. You get labor that's not coming in. You get rising labor costs, and that's affecting everybody from farmers to the manufacturers. And so none of that has anything to do with interest rates or tariffs or any of that. That has to do with, can you get a leader in the White House who can broker some kind of agreement between Republicans and Democrats to free up the labor market? And Americans have been asking for that since the 1980s. So again, it's like, what is really changing here in the grand scheme of things? Like, we're actually dealing with a lot of the issues that we've been dealing with before. So I don't think this is unambiguously bad or good, depending on who wins. I think there are going to be pockets of the market that are just in the beginning stages of bull runs just because of where technology is at and where technology adoption is at. And there are others that may be long in the tooth. And that's all just going to depend on sort of things that happen in the normal context of the economy that have nothing to do with who wins next week.
Yeah, that which is really something, considering how much has been pinned on this. What do you, when you say pockets of the economy because we're in the tech cycle, is that AI still? Because there's so much doubt around AI. We saw Google come out with good numbers. By the way, we've got Mend, Microsoft reporting after the bell here. So is technology still a bright spot?
I think technology is a bright spot, but it's already too bright. In some sense, you've missed the move in AI, and we've had this succession of very high moves. Nuclear is the one that is taking off right now. If you look at all the uranium stocks and the nuclear stocks and the utilities, like nuclear is now the thing that has gotten really shiny. I prefer to look at the things that have been beaten down that I don't think are going to get beaten down in general. One example I'll give you is U.S. agriculture is approaching depression level feelings. Like if you talk to U.S. farmers, they are profoundly pessimistic. They are profoundly worried. They're getting crunched by rising inputs and higher interest rates. The labor market issues that I'm talking about really affect them. And commodity prices have been relatively down. All of which is to say, when everybody is scared, that's when I'm interested. So I am extremely interested in things like robotics when it comes to apple picking or trying to solve problems with labor in actual farms, or thinking about some of these commodity plays that haven't gone where people thought they were going to go in the last year or two, and that things are going to get worse. So, I mean, that's one pocket I would look at. Biotech is another. We got a little bit of a taste in COVID of just how fast we have advanced from a biotech perspective. And I don't want to get into a whole masks and did you take the vaccine, not take the vaccine? I don't care about that. I mean, Moderna and Pfizer and these different companies that are using mRNA technology, they had the blueprint for the vaccine within a couple of weeks of actually sequencing the virus. You don't technically have to wait years for things like that to happen. And just look at how that's happening with different drugs. We've already seen it with obesity and Ozempic and all those things, but there's all sorts of drugs that are coming and all sorts of innovations that we're doing with biotech that I think are extremely interesting. And then the last thing I'll just say is, again, this goes with whether it's Trump or whether it's Harris, you are going to get protectionism and subsidies from the US government for industries that are deemed critical. So that could be semiconductors, that could be critical minerals, that could be aerospace related industries. Like there are going to be pockets there where there are going to be real opportunities for companies that are able to line up public dollars and private interests and put them together. That's the genesis of the semiconductor industry in the first place. Like that's the sort of opportunity that I think we're setting up for. So those are just some examples.
That's a great point. And it is that sort of public-private partnership that we don't always think of at first blush here in the way that you say would state-sponsored in Europe. But you're certainly having a lot more conversations about industrial policy as national security policy. And on biotech, just to your point, hi, everyone in the chat. It's great to see you. By the way, someone wrote in on the comments, how do I get in the chat? If you are not, you have to be a subscriber, and then you can be in the live chat that should be visible on your YouTube channel. So subscribe and jump in because everyone there is fantastic. And they were just pointing out on Google's call that this is Ched. Google's earnings call yesterday, they stated 25% of coding is now done by AI. So these AI advances are huge. They're just happening exponentially. So it makes sense that they're going to be starting to hit sectors and make a real impact. There seems to be a lot of, we were just talking about this before we came on air. I don't know if any of you saw the story about Truth Terminal. If you have not, I'm sure some of you in the chat have. Go check it out. It's happened over the last week or so, and some really crazy things when two AI sort of agent spots were put together and released on Twitter, and there's a meme coin around it, but just sort of they created their own religion. It's a really, really fascinating story of just how quickly this is moving. Do you feel, Jacob, that there is skepticism around AI and the impact it can have on corporate earnings? Not about the technology itself or the fact that we're on the cusp of a revolution. I believe most people agree with that. But to the extent it's going to impact the bottom line, there seems to be skepticism about this, or a feeling that, we hear a lot about the AI bubble. It doesn't sound like you think we're in one, but you have to be discerning. Am I reading that right from you?
I mean, I think there has been a sea change. I mean, 3 or 4 years ago, this was something that it was fairly popular to discount. I think you've had sort of the first bubble, and now things are coming back down to earth because everybody's heard about it and everybody knows that to impress people on investor calls, you have to say, oh, and we're going to use AI and auto, blah, blah, blah. And then, all those talking points are out there. We're probably now in the phase where people are actually starting to use it, and some will be successful. And for some, it'll blow up in their faces. And for some, they're not doing it at all. They just want to say that they're using it and get the sentiment that comes with it. But I think if you're looking out at a 5-10 year time horizon, yes, it's going to be absolutely massive. And even if you have a small correction here as people actually start utilizing the technology, if you think 5-10 years down the road, yes, we're probably in the very early cycles of this. And all of this also relates back to the actual hardware. Like, if we're talking about AI, we also have to talk about power generation, and we also have to talk about chips, and we also have to talk about materials. And all of these things are going to be connected to what happens with AI. And probably we're going to see massive innovations in those areas. Whoever can unlock the cheapest amount of energy, that's probably the country that is going to be able to do things with AI that nobody else is going to be able to, because they'll be able to satisfy energy demand. That's why you see US tech companies like Microsoft toying around with 3 Mile Island, because they're looking in the most unimaginable places possible 2-3 years ago for where they're going to get power. So yes, I think we're in the very early innings of this. And if you think about over the next 5, 10, 15 years, you want to be identifying those players that are going to profit from AI increasing, and then also the people with the picks and shovels who actually get us from point A to point B. Those are all things that I think are very early stages.
Yeah, and that brings us back to foreign policy, because a lot of those materials and the supply chain related to tech is in China. So is it realistic to start a tariff war with China, given our reliance on them still when it comes to processing so much of this, even energy?
The United States and China rely on things from each other. So there's no one country that has leverage here. That's what makes it such an interesting conflict. And despite the first Trump administration and the Biden administration have been very hawkish on China, they haven't actually changed that much. Look at when Trump complains that China's just exporting through Mexico into the United States, he's basically right. If you look at a chart of Mexican imports from China, they've gone up and to the right. And that's how trade works. Unless you shut everything off, it's going to get in there. So we haven't really seen the breakdown in U.S.-China trade, even after the first salvos of the trade war, because both sides are dependent on each other. But you're exactly right that when it comes to actually making things or actually processing things and refining things, that's what the Chinese are good at. When it comes to design and theoretical and some of the higher end machinery that you need to make some of these things happen, China's way behind, and the United States is trying to push on those advantages in general. That's one of the reasons why one of the companies that I watch most closely, and you can't invest in them, but watching how Huawei has evolved from when the Trump administration first put on the sanctions against them, how they were basically out in the wilderness for a couple of years, and then just in the last 12 months have come roaring back with their own chips, with smartphones that look better than anything that is being put out by US tech companies, and people buying them hand over fist. You're absolutely right that China is a different kind of competitor for the United States in general. And it underscores what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a 5-10 year time horizon. If we do have protectionism from the United States and China selectively in some of these industries, prices are going to go up. And you're probably going to get so much investment in some of these places that there will be a glut of supply at some point. And then we will wake up in 2020, and the things that we were worried about, suddenly there's going to be more of them than we possibly know what to do with. And maybe the cost of these things begins to come down. That's how market cycles sort of work in general. So I think you're right to point out that if the United States pushes China on this, yes, you're looking at inflation and delays in some of the rollouts of some of these technologies that will probably take years and will require the US government and private industry to work together in ways that they really haven't worked together on since the 1950s and 60s. But when you get through that, we'll have too much of these things, the cost of these things will go down, and then everybody will be able to use them, and they'll be that much better.
So China's efforts to stimulate its economy, what kind of footing are they on should they encounter a Trump president who is pushing hard to sort of, whether you believe that it will be a full-out economic war, tariff war, or you're more in the Marco camp where they're going to try to broker a deal with the Chinese, but they're going to try to get it on the best terms possible. What kind of leverage does China have? What is the state of its economy?
China's in a really difficult spot right now. They have not been able to solve their real estate crisis, and all of the structural problems that have brought them to this point have not been solved. And there's no real good way for the Chinese to solve them. Now, we've been hearing now for weeks that there has been a change in how the PBOC and how the Chinese officials are thinking about this. And maybe, it's been like 3 different meetings now. They said they were going to announce details. The next one is November 8th. So now everybody's like, okay, we're really going to do it this time and talk about direct fiscal stimulus and big payouts to banks and things like that. I don't know. We'll see. But yeah, China's in an incredibly difficult space. It's why I don't take a lot of China's military threats in the South China Sea that seriously. It's why Xi Jinping has become a dictator, because he knows that he has to redistribute massive amounts of wealth from the coast of the interior without inciting a revolution or without people coming to take him out, the wealthy coastal elites. So I think they have a very difficult problem on their hands. At the same time, we're talking here on Wednesday, October 3rd. Last week, everybody was talking about the BRICS summit. You asked me before we hit record what people ask me about. BRICS is always something that people ask me about, and I always say, whatever. Like, the BRICS don't actually do anything; they just put out statements. But what happened at the BRICS summit that was really interesting was China and India put to bed a 4-year diplomatic spat over territorial disagreements on the line of control between China and India. You might remember 4 or 5 years ago, they were fighting with each other on the border, literal soldiers clashing, and it caused a shutdown in supply chains across China and India increasing its involvement with the West. Well, suddenly that's gone, and both sides are implementing things. And I couldn't help but think, if you're China, what are the things that you need? You have a massive oversupply of things that you've manufactured. What does India have? 1 billion people who want to buy shiny things. If you're India, what do you want? Well, you probably want all that intellectual property that China has either stolen or developed over the past 30, 40 years, so you can start manufacturing some of these things and not being so dependent on the West and replicating everything that China is going through itself right now. So if you're looking, I think China's already preparing its parachutes. I think it's looking out at the world and thinking, hey, like, what are some of the countries that we can use to try and make this a little bit easier for ourselves? How do we redistribute our own trade and economic relations in ways that are good for the Chinese economy? The last thing I'll just say there is, in some ways, it would be good for Xi Jinping and China if it was Trump, because it's much easier to point at the United States and say, look, we have an enemy here. This is not the Chinese Communist Party's fault. Look at this man who is declaring 6% tariffs and all these things against us. You can use that as a rally around the flag sort of moment. So look, I don't discount at all how serious China's problems are. I think they're going to be dealing with this for the next 5 to 8 years, sort of realistically. But if they can metabolize some of these challenges, and I think they will, if you put a gun to my head, I would say I think they'll get through it. They're going to be in a very different and a much better position, I think, down the road. But the short term, in the short term, they really don't have a lot of the leverage, which is why when somebody like Marco says there might be a short-term deal, yes, there might be something there for the United States to work with if it's open to it.
Yeah, but it really interesting to point out, and it's exactly the kind of story that doesn't get enough attention, that it's working on a longer-term solution if it can improve its ties with India. And India has made it very clear it wants to be neutral. It is not sort of, although it has relations with the U.S. and Modi comes over here and, there's a lot of show, it's been keeping things at arm's length. We have a couple questions. Ralph wanting to know about Japan as well. And we've had a lot going on in Japan. Again, it gets eclipsed by the election happening here. But what's your take on the state of Japan right now?
Japan is extremely important. I'm somebody who's been bullish on Japan for years, and I would say that my overall geopolitical macro outlook is still fairly bullish. But, we're dealing with an LDP that is going to lose its majority for the first time since, I believe, 2009. Suddenly, we're going to see a lot of instability in Japanese politics that we hadn't seen for some time. Since Shinzo Abe really transformed Japanese politics, you've had Japan basically behaving in the same way for over a decade, which has been trying to, increase growth in the economy in lots of innovative ways, strengthening ties with the West, identifying China as a major national security threat and trying to position Japan in that context, and even strengthening Japanese security forces for eventual conflict if it came to that. I'm not so sure that that's the case depending on what happens in Japanese politics right now, because you have a lot of different voices out there. You also have, this is sort of, Japan is coming late to this party. But part of the problem and part of the reason that you have this loss of the majority for the LDP is because they were involved with corruption scandals. And Japanese people, even though they've seen pretty good economic growth over the last decade or so, inequality has risen and things aren't being enjoyed equally. And so now Japanese society is kicking back against that. And so maybe you open the door to populist voices there as well. I say at the big macro level, Japan is facing incredible threats. And usually when Japan faces these kinds of threats, if you go back to the Meiji Restoration or if you go back to the 1930s, Japanese society organizes itself totally in such a way to attack the problem. That's just the kind of national culture that they have. And I think they are reaching that kind of moment. And maybe some of these political instability blips that we're having right now are the beginning of a major change in how Japan is thinking about the world. But even with that sort of rose-tinted take, there is no denying that the Japan that emerged out of that election last week, and as we go into the actual election for the leadership, like it's going to be a very different Japan than we've been dealing with since 2009.
That is a major shift in a really important region. You mentioned a couple times different countries having to address the issue of income redistribution. Are we going to see that in the U.S. as well? Because even though it's the economy, stupid, and voters are motivated and not happy with the economy and think it should be handled better, you also ticked off a bunch of things about the economy that are really good. So there's something that they feel is broken. A lot of people point to the fact that while some are doing really well, others have been hollowed out and are sick of it. Is there income redistribution coming one way or another here in the U.S. as well?
I think that's a little strong. What is happening, and I mean, it's been a very slight change, but if we had been having this conversation in 2019 or 2018, one of my favorite talking points was looking at U.S. wealth inequality and pointing out that it was at its highest level since we started taking data on this. So including the Great Depression, I believe the data went back to something like 1919. That trend has started to reverse itself in the last couple of years. Now we're talking about, coming back from the biggest gulf in wealth inequality in U.S. history. So even if there has been some improvement, it's not like the situation is that much better. But the trend line has at least reversed. And that has to do with some combination of economic growth and maybe productivity gains and maybe some of the direct stimulus from COVID being out there in the mix. Like you can try and ascribe causality to as many different variables as you want, but there has been some change there. The honest answer to your question is we'd need a psychoanalyst to explain what's going on in the American psyche. I mean, I think you can talk about things like inflation is outpacing gains in wages. I think you can talk about how the middle class has been hollowed out. I think you can talk about how a lot of people, especially in the United States, derive meaning from their work. And there were wide swaths, especially of the manufacturing economy, that got taken out as a result of globalization. And so even that meant at the top level that wealth was increasing and a lot of people did well. A lot of people weren't doing well, and the US government didn't help those people, didn't support those people, didn't help them retrain, didn't have a safety net for them in the context of the free trade policies that the United States was pushing. So if we start stirring the witch's brew here on Halloween for all the different things that went into this, we could throw a bunch of things into the cauldron. I don't know what the single be all end all is, but there is definitely something in the U.S. electorate where they're just not happy with where it's going. And it's probably some combination of all the things that I just named.
Yeah, that makes sense. A couple of big areas that we haven't touched on that I want to quickly get your thoughts on. Ukraine. Now, that just seems mired in sort of an endless cycle. And certainly it's been an issue. There seems to be pockets of Congress and the American people who no longer want to support it. What do you see happening in Ukraine?
It's the largest land war in Europe since World War II, and it gets relegated to the bottom of the page, basically. If I had Zelensky in front of me right now and I was advising him, I would tell him it doesn't matter who wins this election, you should give up on the United States because the United States will eventually give up on you. Maybe it takes a year, maybe it takes 3 years, I don't know, but eventually the United States will get tired of this and will take its toys and go home. Ukraine's future is going to depend entirely on whether the Europeans stand up and support Ukraine against Russia going forward. And we've seen some signs that that's going to happen. You've seen some states like Denmark or like France, which are willing to now provide weapons and thinking about reorienting European manufacturing for providing these things to Ukraine. You've also seen Ukraine, Zelensky a couple of weeks ago it was his sort of victory plan. He presented it to the Ukrainian parliament. And one of the most interesting things about that plan was for the first time since the war started, one of his goals at the end of the war wasn't the Ukrainian reconquest of all the eastern territory that Russia has taken. So maybe there's a little sliver of a door open there for, okay, Russia takes over the east and Western Ukraine gets welcomed into NATO or some kind of European defense arrangement, and you can go from there. But the depressing thing about Ukraine is just that Russia is using its time-honored grand strategy of being willing to outsuffer its opponents. It's going to stay there and outdie and outsuffer and outcare everybody until everybody else goes home and there's nothing left. And that's what they're doing. I mean, they're churning eastern Ukraine into dust, and slowly by square mile, they're taking more of it. So I think what ends up happening is that eastern Ukraine probably falls under Russian influence indefinitely, and whether Western Ukraine and how Western Ukraine exists depends on what the European appetite is for supporting Kyiv and supporting the Ukrainian government going forward. And this, again, is a way in which the election does really matter in the United States. And it's ironically, it's not the way that most people think. If it's Trump, then there is a much better chance that the Europeans wake up the next day and say, oh, we definitely need a European defense initiative. We definitely need to make sure that Ukraine wins and that we have a better and stronger military for ourselves. If they wake up and it's Harris and it's the same bromides that Biden has been giving to Europe, probably the United States will keep footing the bill for years going forward, and we can keep squabbling about the things that we want to squabble about in general. So if it's Trump, it's a real acceleration towards this European nationalist future that I'm talking about. And in some ways, I think it is better for Ukraine, even if that's counterintuitive.
And Israel, Iran, the Middle East, and the role of Saudi Arabia. I mean, that's a huge question, but what do you see happening there?
At the first firm I ever worked at, it was the artist formerly known as Stratfor. I think Rain acquired them and sunsetted the name. But I had a colleague there who used to describe the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as job security. And boy, has he ever been proven right with that little quip. I think the key takeaway from the Middle East is that nobody really wants this to escalate out of control. Despite everything that's happened, oil is flirting, mid 60s or high 60s, I think it was today. I didn't look at what Brent crude did today, but you've got real people looking at charts and saying, could we go to the 50s, despite the fact that we have all of these conflicts? I have been saying, I think when historians look back at the year 2024, I think that maybe the thing that will outshine everything, that will outshine the US election and the Japanese election and the Indian election and all the storms and everything else, is that a ragtag group of Yemeni militants were able to bring shipping through the Red Sea to a complete and total halt. And even more than a year after the October 7th attacks that started this current round of Middle Eastern violence, most Western ships are avoiding the Red Sea and avoiding the Suez Canal completely. The only things going through that route are Russian oil tankers and people who are probably trading drugs or other illicit things. And we don't feel that in the economy because oil has been so low, because there's been too much oil on the market. But let's say oil came back up to $100 a barrel. Like, what does that do when you start factoring in shipping costs and all these other sorts of things? So that's still happening. And it's another one of these stories that, because it's been happening for so long, I think it gets relegated to the bottom, but it's still there. The last thing I'll just say about the Middle East, and this is one area in which I was wrong. I thought that Iran had a lot of leverage over Israel. And Israel it's almost like Israel is trying to atone for the national security mistakes it made that led to October 7th. I mean, they have decimated Hamas in Gaza. They have decimated Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And they're even, showing the capacity to strike at the Yemeni militants, the Houthis themselves, or to strike at Iranian air defense themselves. I didn't think they had those types of capabilities. You can think whatever you want to morally about what the Israelis are doing. I'm sure people have their opinions. I have my opinions too. But when you just look at what they've been able to accomplish, it's pretty incredible. I worry, though, about what it sets up for the future, because you're just breeding future generations that are going to be that much more angry at Israel going forward. Remember that Hezbollah was created in the 1980s when Israel invaded southern Lebanon to go after the PLO. Like, Hezbollah was a reaction to that. So maybe you get a worse faction that comes out afterwards. And the one country that has been super quiet amidst all of this in the Middle East, and it's the country that we should be talking about first when we talk about the Middle East. It's not the Saudis, it's not the Israelis, it's not even the Iranians, it's the Turks. This is the Turks region. It's going to be Turkey's sphere of influence. They are a rising power, a rising military power, a rising economic power. And what do we hear from Turkey on this? It's basically crickets.
Yeah, you've been pointing out the importance of Turkey for the last few times I've talked to you. Why? How do you see that playing out? What is their long game? They're quiet now, but what is their goal?
They don't want to have enemies or allies. They want to be open for business with everyone. So they want to be able to have a good relationship with Russia at the same time that they want to supply drones to the Ukrainians. They want to be a leader of the Muslim world at the same time they ignore what the Chinese are doing to the Uyghurs. They want to have access to Israeli trade and Israeli tech at the same time that they want to be seen as protectors of the Palestinian cause. So they are good at playing all these sides off of each other. And I think one of the reasons for that is they're not in a place yet where they can really assert themselves. They're still dependent on importing food and energy for example, from Russia. They've stolen some market share from Europe in terms of manufacturing, but their economy still has a lot of different problems and a lot of different structural problems that it has to sort through. But you can see what they're building towards. And historically, when you have worlds that are very competitive, whatever country is in control of what is today Istanbul, which was once Constantinople, the Bosporus, it's a very rich region of trade in general. And there's going to be a power there that is probably going to be able to connect all these different regions in the world and be open for business. So I think that's what Turkey is playing at. It wants to be that connective tissue between Europe and Asia. It wants to be the place that soaks up all of this interest and all of this investment by virtue of where it is. And it doesn't want to be seen as going after any one country in general. But make no mistake, they will eventually get strong enough to where they will start to assert themselves a little bit more. And if we talked about if I had Zelensky in front of me, if I had the Netanyahu government in front of me, the first thing I would tell them is, would you stop worrying about Iran? Your long-term threat is to the north. They're slowly biding their time and you're pissing them off at every single turn. Maybe you might want to think about that a little bit, because ultimately, I think what happens in the Middle East is going to go through Istanbul, not through Tehran, not through Jerusalem, and not through Riyadh.
Wow. Does that make Turkey an attractive investment destination, or too much political concern or risk?
It's one of my, it's one of my 5 countries that I'm most interested in from an investment perspective. There's obviously higher risk there, but, at Bespoke, like the work that we've done on Turkey and some of the things that we've done with Turkey have been some of our best trades, like in the last 5 years, because we're willing to go and touch those things in places that people aren't. So I won't tell you that there's no risk. You really have to do your diligence there, but there's tremendous opportunities in Turkey. It's one of the countries I am most optimistic about from an investment perspective in terms of being able to capitalize on some of these geopolitical forces that I talk about all the time.
Incredible. Jacob, it's always so good to catch up with you and hear your thoughts and get some sort of frank discussion around what's going on and get beneath the headlines and pay attention to what's really important. Just as we close out, the last bit of this, it's so easy to get sucked up into the domestic, but it's so important to keep your eye on the international. Are you of the mindset that some of the best opportunities are actually going to be in some of these international markets? It sounds like it.
Yes. I mean, I think we've seen that the U.S. has outperformed international for 20 or 30 years. And I think that corresponds very neatly with the unipolar moment in the world, where the United States was the unquestioned military, economic, political security power in the world. And it wasn't just the United States. If you had bet on the countries that were the biggest benefactors of free trade and of the United States leading that push towards globalization, it was countries like Germany, or countries like China even. China doesn't exist, the level of wealth that we're talking about in China doesn't happen if there isn't free trade and China soaking up all of that manufacturing investment and intellectual property and things like that from around the world. So yes, I am absolutely looking for countries where you've got that are going to be more competitive in a world that is becoming more multipolar and more geopolitically competitive. That said, and this, you can sort of feel this suffused in everything that I said with you today, I'm really actually much more interested in different pockets and different sectors. Like I'm interested in going into certain countries and saying, okay, well, this sector in this country I'm very interested in. I'll give you a tangible example of what I'm talking about. A lot of people will ask me, well, what do you think about India? And I'll be like, I couldn't explain to you what I think about India if I had a week, because India is 1 billion people and this many different languages. Who the heck knows? There are certain areas of India which I'm profoundly optimistic about. This is a country that when Modi was first elected, he said by the end of his term, everybody should have indoor plumbing. Like that's the level of development we're talking about here. So air conditioning manufacturers in India, toilet manufacturers in India, lots of possibilities. If you're talking about low-end manufacturing and ascending from that point of view, lots of interesting opportunities there. There are other parts of India that have to do with red tape and corruption and taxes that I want nothing to do with. So you could sort of go through that at any point. So the way that I'll reframe what you said is, yes, I am more optimistic international versus national, but that's self-serving. I'm an international geopolitical analyst. There are some sectors of the United States, like I said, biotech or aerospace or some of these areas that might be ahead of any international opportunity that I see out there at all. So the one message I have for listeners is get away from this idea that you're just going to throw money into an index and it's going to go up and to the right and everything is going to be fine. I think we're going through a period of of volatility, where inflation is going to be volatile and returns are going to be volatile. And at a national level, things might be choppy, whereas sectors might be really, really good. And it's sectors that you want to focus on. So that's what I'm thinking about on a 5-10 year horizon. Where are the sectors? Where are the geographies? And where are the macro dynamics telling me that things are going to be good? I have to put all those things together rather than just saying, don't go international over US. If you do that based on this advice, I don't think you would do well.
Yeah, no, and that really speaks to what we've heard elsewhere too, that active management. You really have to, and beware the ETF bucket that you think is emerging, perhaps when it, you've really got to get underneath the sheets and figure out where those investments are. It's not that easy, as you say, to just chuck it in a gigantic index. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but a level of due diligence is going to be needed in this time. Jacob, thank you so much. So wonderful. I hope you get some rest and aren't too stressed out through the remainder of what is going to be a crazy week in the lead up to this election.
Maggie, the election is coming, and then my second daughter is due a week and a half later, so there is no rest happening for this analyst. So ping me anytime you want. I'll be awake.
Oh my gosh. Well, that is amazing. Congratulations on the new edition. Are you man-to-man coverage still, or? Yeah, two.
Yes, this is second, so this is the last of the man-to-man coverage. So
amazing. Well, congrats, and good luck through the whole thing. It's going to be wonderful. Enjoy every moment if you can break away for a second. Action packed for Jacob Shapiro's household.
I plan to. So cheers.
You're not going to name her after any candidates or anything crazy, are you?
No.
Just had to ask. All right, Jacob, take good care. Thanks so much. Thanks for everybody in the chat. We'll post this whole thing, and we've got some great people coming up, including Ed Yardeni. I'm going to tape something with him and release it. And we've got Jeff Snyder as well. We can talk to us all about the dollar. So stay tuned for all of that in the coming days. Thanks, everybody. Take care and good luck out there.